Good afternoon. We began, but we had a technical problem. So before beginning, I'd like to ask you all to have your microphones muted during the meeting, unless you're speaking, and you can unmute it before intervening. I apologize in advance if we experience any technical difficulties in the course of this meeting. Participants may select the preferred language to hear the interpretation or choose the non option to hear the original language of the speaker. If you face any audio or video issues during the meeting, you may send a private message to the host on the platform. So now I would invite the Commission to turn to agenda item 3 and its sub-items A, entitled Inclusive Resilient Recovery from COVID-19 for Sustainable Livelihoods, Well-being and Dignity for All, Eradicating Poverty and Hunger in All Its Forms and Dimensions to Achieve the 2030 Agenda, and B, entitled Review of relevant United Nations plans and programs of action pertaining to the situation of social groups, to hold an interactive dialogue with senior officials of the United Nations system on the priority time. So this is the objective of the panel today. I welcome you all to this interactive dialogue. We have a large number of participants, and this may change in the course of the afternoon. Following the high-level panel discussion on the priority theme, the Commission held on Monday, 7th of February, today, senior representatives of the United Nations system will share their recent activities in helping to ensure inclusive and resilient recovery from COVID-19 for sustainable livelihoods, well-being and dignity for all by implementing effective strategies to eradicate poverty and hunger, to realize the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development in the broader context of their respective United Nations entities. The main objective of today's dialogue is to exchange ideas on current trends, good practices, innovative approaches and lessons learned at the regional levels to strengthen the United Nations system support to member states in implementing the 2030 Agenda. So I would like to make a few comments as chair and on behalf of Argentina in particular. Now, first of all, I would like to say to all that this is a very important meeting, so we must understand how the different specialized agencies and bodies in the United Nations are working together to deal with the challenges that the international community is now facing. In this regard, it's essential that we work together within the United Nations system. And this should be reflected in the work of every resident coordinated. In the work that we undertake every day here in New York, there are attempts to create new structures when in fact there are already bodies and agencies, specialized agencies, which have the primary competence in areas such as food, education, and they have high-level senior officials and a lot of experience over many years in these fields. Also, allow me to welcome the members from the regional groups to deal with the challenges that each region is facing in eradicating hunger and poverty. As I said in the opening, the new social contract that we need should be based on solidarity. We cannot continue to live in a society in which growth, economic growth, is concentrated on a few people and poverty affects millions, where from one day to the next there are people who do not have food to eat. So I would like to call upon you, the representatives of the system, to consider this tragic reality. I am sure that today's discussion will be not only very interesting, but also very useful for our future steps. Thank you very much. So having said that, let us begin, and I am pleased to welcome the distinguished panelists. Mr. Mario Simoli, Deputy Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic Commission for Latin America and Caribbean, Mr. Munir Tabed, Deputy Executive Secretary of the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Western Asia, and Mr. Maximum Torero, Chief Economist of the Food and Agricultural Organization, the FAO, and Ms. Asa Regna, Deputy Executive Director for Policy, Program, Civil Society and Intergovernmental Support at the United Nations Entity for Gender Equality and the Empowerment of Women, and Ms. Beat Andres, Special Representative and Director of the International Labour Organization, the ILO. I'm also pleased to welcome the moderator, Ms. Maria Francesca Spatolisano, Assistant Secretary General for Policy Coordination and Interagency Affairs of the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs. To keep this panel interactive, in this roundtable, we will have 2 rounds of presentations by the panelists. After each round, the floor will be open for questions and comments from the floor to which panelists can then respond. Before giving the floor to Ms. Spatolisano, I wish to remind panelists to please keep to their allocated time limit of 6 minutes per presentation for each round, and delegations to keep within the 3-minute time limit during the interactive discussion. So I now turn the meeting over to Ms. Spatolisano to conduct the interactive dialogue with senior United Nations officials on the priority theme, and I look forward to a productive and interesting exchange of views. Ms. Spatolisano, you have the floor, madam. Thank you very much, Madam Ambassador.
Words of introduction and then go straight into the panel. Over the last 2.5 years, we have had the opportunity to learn from high-level government officials, experts, representatives of civil societies about the policies, the measures, the innovative initiatives to combat poverty and hunger and food insecurity, so to ensure well-being and dignity for all during the COVID-19 pandemic and beyond. The UN system has been supporting member states in their response to the COVID pandemic to counter the socioeconomic impacts and protect people's well-being. While DESA, the Department of Economic and Social Affairs, has been focusing on analysis and provision of policy support to intergovernmental bodies in their normative and policy guidance work, the regional commissions and the UN funds, programs, and specialized agencies have played a critical role to connect these UN norms and guidance with the national actions on the ground. So this interactive dialogue will allow the high-level officials of UN entities to engage with member states, sharing insights and expertise based on their agency work and activities at the global, regional, and national levels. And they will highlight lessons learned, showcase policy measures, and this interaction, as the chair said, aims to assist member states in their effort to make inclusive and resilient recovery and get back on track to achieve the 2030 agenda and leaving no one behind. The panelists, it's a fabulous set of 5 panelists already introduced by the chair, and we will have, as she said, 2 rounds and a question and answer after each round. I'll try to keep the time without interfering, but invite everybody and count on your cooperation for this purpose. And we will have in the first round basically a sort of assessment, state of the play on poverty and hunger, including the impacts, of course, of COVID. And then in the second part, we will look more into the way forward and plans and strategies for the recovery. So without further ado, let me go to the panelists for their first presentation. And I would like to invite the first panelist of this distinguished group, Mr. Mario Cimoli. Mario, please, the floor is yours.
Gracias, muchísimas gracias. Quiero saludar a la representante permanente argentina.
I'd like to pay tribute to the permanent representative of Argentina, Maria Carmen. Hello, it's a pleasure to be with you, and I'd also like to pay tribute to Ms. Spatolisano. Thank you very much. So I'm going to put the presentation.
Okay, perfecto. ¿Se puede ver?
So fine. So can you all see that? We can't hear you. We cannot hear you well. At least we can't hear you terribly. Can you hear me now? Just slightly. Your voice is very weak. So I'm thinking of the interpreters. The Secretariat, Claudia, can you hear me? Can the interpreters hear in the English
Madam
booth?
Chair,
Yes.
we can hear you.
So we can hear you now. Thank you very much. So it's a pleasure to be with you. I'd like to welcome the two Marias, great friends. Great to be with you. So I will make a presentation, the first part of what is happening in the region, and share with you a way of sharing the most important variables. The growth has recovered, but not in all economies. We see growth here. So 8 and 6.2. So there has been an improvement with regard to unemployment. It has recovered. This is a very important theme. The unemployment has affected mainly women. So it is an issue which is very serious and is continuing. There's another theme which needs to be clear, and this has been shown throughout the region. We see that Latin America is the most unequal, but it's improved over recent years. But the trend is once again moving backwards. So we have an increase in inequality, we have an increase in extreme poverty, and we have continuing poverty in general. Now, another important issue that is continuing is an economy. Now, look at Latin America, a great producer of food, which shouldn't have problems, but continues to be a region that does have problems of food security. And this affects the entire region for 40%, and basically in the Caribbean, where it affects 70% of the population. So with regard to emerging from COVID-19, we must consider the vulnerability of the middle class. So they could be falling into extreme poverty. This changes, and its affects children, girls, and indigenous peoples. What's also clear in this process is that the economy, on the one hand, improved its possibility to intervene, but the basic conditions continue the same. So I'll move on to the next. So here's clear. For the first time in history, in the countries of this region, there was not just new policies that are horizontal, basic salary, dealing with hunger, etc. So this has been improving the situation with regard to poverty. Poverty levels continue to be high, but these universal policies are very important. What we are concerned with is the tax situation and financing. This is being limited, so it's going to be very difficult to allow governments to intervene as they did in the past. On the other hand, inflation is a continuing element. It's affecting many of the economies at the regional level. We see data published yesterday for Chile, which we see it increased by 2.2%. So this is affecting poverty, vulnerability. So we have a situation. We see some recovery, but the structural problems continue to be the same, and in some cases are worsening. So here I try to summarize one of the themes which is of key importance for ECLAC. It is to understand what is behind this, understand development, understand that this social situation is part of this model. We need to, we have emerged from this situation, but There are some high productivity sectors, natural resources, for example, but the individuals employed in the informal sector continue to be considerable in numbers. So where there's a diminution in productivity, and this affects the access to social protection. So emerging after COVID, we are working on this, but we need to have a economic growth rate. And we see that the basic structural problems have not been resolved. So as this is taking place, and this will be covered in the second part of my presentation, we have emerged from this, but at the same time, we continue to have the economic structural conditions which continue to exist. Informal economy, employment affecting women, children, and indigenous peoples. This continues to be something which continues despite measures being taken. Now, the other problem is the informal economy. This continues to grow, 53% at the regional level. So how can we change this? How can we ensure that there's a fundamental change in this regard so that we can increase development? Now, this will be for the second part. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mario. No need to tell you about time. You are very good at that. Thank you. And now I pass the floor to Mr. Munir Tabet from ESWA. And we know that you are in a little crisis of energy there, so I hope your connection will work. Let me know. Munir, are you connected?
I am connected. Can you see me?
Good. Yes, we can. Please go ahead.
Excellent. I will share my screen, but let me first recognize the ambassador of Argentina, colleagues, Ms. Spazzolizano, and the member states who are attending this meeting. Let me share my screen, if I may. So my colleague from Latin America was almost speaking the same language that we have in the Arab region, where ESWA covers 20 of the 22 Arab countries. I will explain a little bit the situation prior to COVID and after COVID to demonstrate the difference that has taken place. Prior to COVID, our growth was on average 3%. While there has been high growth in countries like Egypt, Libya, and Djibouti, but fairly negative growth for Lebanon, Sudan, and Yemen. But even the GCC was performing at below the average in 2019. Poverty was about 5.8%, that's extreme poverty. And the region is known for its inequality. It's perhaps the most unequal region in the world, where top 10% of earners account for more than 60% of national income, at least in some countries. Unemployment, official unemployment is 8.1%, but obviously there's a lot of hidden unemployment. Women's unemployment is at 18.6%. This is all prior to the COVID conflict. And youth unemployment very high at 23%. Health, education, and water have not fared much better. The health system is fragmented. Part of it is destroyed by the conflict, insufficient primary care. About 15 million students out of school, about half of the households don't have internet access or a computer. A serious problem with regards to water and hygiene necessary for the protection from COVID. About 74 million people from the region did not have access to basic washing hand washing facilities, as well as basic lack of drinking water. Gender inequality, a little bit like other regions, perhaps a little bit more. Women spend about 5 times more than men in unpaid work. The labor participation rate is half of that of men, and about 84 million women are not connected to the internet, nor do they have access to a mobile phone. The response of member states has been actually shy. About 4% of GDP was spent on the stimulus. This is on the regional average, compared to 22.5 in Europe. About 94% of this were stimulus, were soft loans. That's about a total of 102 billion. Vaccination rate vary dramatically between one country and another. 95% coverage in UAE, 1% in Yemen, and the range is somewhere in between. The COVID pandemic demonstrated or shown the weakness in the social protection system. Only 65%, only 35% of the people are covered in some form of social protection or another. Post-COVID situation, obviously, we have a contraction of about 6%, with the possible exception of Egypt, whose economy performed better than the average. The contraction was biggest in Libya, Lebanon, and Tunisia, and you can see the numbers on the screen, quite worrisome. Even oil exporting countries experiences contraction, about 5.5% on average. Unemployment increased for women, increased for youth. It's probably the highest unemployment in all regions. About 85% of youth work in informal sectors, and about 39 million people are at risk of losing their jobs. Total unemployment, unlike Latin America, has actually increased between 2019 and 2021. Poverty, 6.1, it increased from 5 point something. It's worse in conflict countries, obviously in Egypt, Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. The Arab region is considered the second poorest region if we use the lower middle income poverty line, which is $3.2 per day. The middle class shrunk significantly, and it has now declined to below 40%. Undernourishment has been recorded in the region. It's about 12%, stunting about 20%, and overweight from poor nutrition by about 10% of the children in the region. Gender inequality, about 700 women, and the pandemic, of course, exacerbated, like all regions, violence against women, particularly domestic violence. Very serious fatality rates, about 19.5% and 7.3% in Yemen and Sudan, respectively, about 151,000 across the region. 100 million students were made out of school because of the pandemic, and about 35 million have no access to internet. The fiscal space shrunk, as is expected. Only 3.7% is projected in terms of growth in 2022. The average ratio of debt to GDP is about 61% and increasing. In countries like Lebanon and Sudan, it's very high at about 180 and 150%. Fiscal deficit is also increasing at 5.6%. And the projected fiscal deficit is serious both in normal countries and GCC countries. Out of the $650 billion SDRs, only 37 billion were allocated to the Arab region. I will stop here and get to the policy recommendation in time. I hope I was heard clearly and that you have seen the presentation. Thank you.
Yes, indeed, very clear, and we could hear and see very well your presentation. Thank you. And now I turn to the Chief Economist of the FAO, Maximo Torero, please, for your initial presentation.
Thank you very much, Francesca, and thank you very much, Ambassador of Argentina. So it's a pleasure to be here, and let me share my presentation. So it has been a great honor for FAO to have supported the Commission along with UNDESA in the preparation of the 60th session. So what is the state of play on poverty and hunger, including the impacts of COVID-19? And this is essentially what I will try to focus in some key elements which we believe are important. First, the world economy, as it has also mentioned by the previous speakers, contracted by 3.4% in 2020, with regions like Latin America and South Asia taking particular severe blow. A rebound of 5.5% took place in 2021, but it has highly been unevenly and largely reflecting a strong recovery in the world's two largest economies, but a much less favorable performance in large parts of the world. This largely reflects global disparities in vaccine access and in the size of the effectiveness of economic stimulus packages. By 2022, global GDP will remain about 2% below the pre-pandemic level, and poorer countries are projected on average to see larger output losses than richer countries, and many developing nations, especially in the sub-Saharan Africa and in Latin America and the Caribbean, are not expected to return to the pre-pandemic levels before 2024. This will continue to widen pre-existing inequalities and to undermine poverty reduction and sustainable development progress. The challenge for the coming years will be to sustain a strong growth momentum and ensure that it fruits and distributed equitable. It's very important because inequality, of course, has been increased as a result of COVID-19. So strong international cooperation and solidarity will be essential in this situation. The GDP contraction and the lockdown increased poverty around the world. According to the World Bank, there was a spike of 97 million more people in poverty in 2020, a historically unprecedented increase in global poverty, with about 60% of the new poor in South Asia and another quarter in sub-Saharan Africa. The prospects remain dire for many of the world's extreme poor, and the majority of whom live in rural areas. In contrast to high-income countries and middle-income countries, and low-income countries and sub-Saharan African countries are expected to see further increases in poverty in 2021 and 2022, and at a faster pace than before the outbreak of the COVID-19. Even the middle-income countries, the situation remains volatile, as they have seen some of the worst waves of the pandemic this year, and further delays in vaccine rollouts, new variants of the virus, increasing debt levels, and rising food prices could also worsen their outlook significantly. In short, we are far from turning the corner on poverty, and the recovery that is taking place will not be sufficient to close the gap, but the pandemic is estimated to have caused in 2020. It's also important to mention that in some regions of the world, like Latin America, as it was shown by Cepal, one of the major problems was the high levels of informality. Because of the lockdowns, the informal sector didn't receive any benefit, and at the same time, they were not able to do their economic activity, depleting their working capital. And as a result, informal economies, which were middle class, that were making some earnings, immediately deplete the earnings. But the worst problem right now is that they also have depleting the working capital. And given that they don't have access to financial markets, this could put in a serious situation their movement into poverty and not necessarily allow them to move back out of poverty fast. Even before COVID-19 outbreak, the world was already not on track to meet the SDGs commitments to end hunger and malnutrition, and in all its forms by 2030. Hunger increased in 2020 and is now affecting about 1 of every 10 persons in the world, or an estimated 768 million people. More than half are in Asia and more than 1/3 are in Africa. Food insecurity, which has been on the rise since 2014, increased sharply in 2020 to affect about 1 in 3 people in the world who could not access to adequate food. Nearly 12% of the world population was severely food insecure, as measured by our FIES Food Insecurity Experience Scale, with women suffering from a higher prevalence of moderate or severe food insecurity than men. Even without the pandemic, already around 3 billion people could not afford a healthy diet in 2019, a number that increased further in 2020 due to COVID-19. Even today, we know that a shock that could affect 1/3 of our population could increase in number even in 1 million more. The COVID-19 pandemic has likely impacted the prevalence of multiple forms of malnutrition, and the current rate of progress on child stunting, exclusive breastfeeding, and low birth weight is insufficient, while progress on child overweight, child wasting, anemia in women of reproductive age, and adult obesity has stalled or is worsening. So again, we are facing a significant challenge, and this is also reflected in the prevalence of undernourishment, the POU, but also our food insecurity experience scale, as is shown here, where we present in red the severe food insecurity, similar to our POU, our undernourishment measure, but also the moderate insecurity, which captures undernutrition as well as overnutrition, where we combine both. In fact, the pandemic has a disproportionate impact on the poor and the vulnerable, laying bare at the same time widening inequalities, as it was mentioned before, but inequalities not only in income, but also in health access and outcomes and learning opportunities, among others. And we have a huge challenge in terms of education and coming back to schools, and we need to focus on that very quickly. Not only has extreme poverty increased into 2020 for the first time in more than 20 years, but inequality has also grown because of the pandemic. The poorest 20% have experienced the steepest decline in incomes, with further declines in 2021, at a time when the top two deciles of the income distribution has begun to recover their 2020 losses. Job and income losses have hit lower skilled workers the hardest. Women, low skilled workers, and informal workers were the most likely to report work stoppages or income losses. And unlike other recessions, where the manufacturing sector typically bears the burn, the COVID-19 induced recession has hit the services sector, which employs 59% of working women globally, particularly hard at a time when women were already bearing disproportionately the burden of the child and domestic care due to the disruptions to schooling during the lockdowns. An inclusive and resilient recovery from COVID-19 will also need to address the increasing inequality between the countries, which has widened since 2020, reversing the trend towards convergence of the previous 2 years. And let me finalize by looking at how we can close these gaps. And closing the gaps and addressing poverty and hunger in all its forms to achieve the SDGs will not be possible in the absence of an inclusive and resilient recovery. Yet by 2023, output in all emerging markets and developing regions is expected to remain below pre-pandemic levels. It is important that more than half of the economies in East Asia and Pacific, Latin America, the Middle East, and North Africa will still be below the 2019 per capita GDP levels by 2023. In 2023, per capita incomes in nearly 40% of emerging markets and developing economies will remain below their 2019 level, including over half of countries facing fragile and conflict-affected situations and 3/4 of the small states. This could be compounded by rising domestic food prices, which will further reduce people's ability to afford healthy food and will likely hit the poorest households the hardest, worsening food insecurity and adding to the pandemic its impact on income inequality. Up to today, the problem is of food access, not of food availability. But if energy prices keep increasing, we can also have a problem of food availability. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And with this, we now hear from the Deputy Executive Director of UN Women, Åsa Regner, please.
Thank you so much, Francesca. Muchísimas gracias a Argentina y a todo el mundo. Con mucho gusto estoy aquí hoy. My colleagues' presentations are certainly sobering, and unfortunately, I think I will continue a bit on the gloomy description of how things are going, because they really are. But I hope in the next round we can come back, or I certainly would like to come back to proposals on how to improve the situation, and my dear co-panelists already did also to some extent. So as we've heard, the pandemic has hit very hard socioeconomically in itself, but it's also acted like a big revealer. We've seen through the virus and its consequences exploited and worsened the inequalities that we already had, including gender inequalities. And it certainly showed how fragile many societies are. A jobs and livelihoods crisis was fueled by the pandemic, and it wiped out fragile progress on women's empowerment as one very prominent example of this. And women, especially those with small children who were already very disadvantaged in the labor force, have lost their jobs at a faster rate and are also regaining them, unfortunately, at a slower rate than men. And women were also to a much larger extent not covered by social security, unemployment benefits, health insurances, etc., compared to men in the world. So also women who were already doing the vast majority of unpaid care work had to take on even more of that during the pandemic. And sometimes those who could keep their jobs because of how the labor market still functioned had to leave their work anyways, because they needed to attend to the increase in care responsibilities that they were not even consulted about. They just happened when schools closed, as one example. We also know that violence against women and girls, which was already the most pervasive of human rights abuses, has spiraled upwards during the crisis. And we did a recent survey in 13 countries, and we found that nearly 50% of women reported that they or a woman they know has experienced a form of violence since the onset of COVID-19. And we also unfortunately see that the violence levels seem to be stuck on higher levels than pre-COVID. So as a result of all of this, poverty is predicted to deepen for women and girls, and my colleagues also outlined from their perspectives why this happened. And as you know, this is devastating to women's and girls' possibility to live their lives as they want to, but it also affects whole societies and economies. New forecasts produced by UN Women, UNDP, and the Pardee Center for International Futures estimate that globally 388 million women and girls will be living in extreme poverty in 2022, compared to 372 million men and boys. And according to these new forecasts, over 80% of the world's extremely poor women and girls live in two regions, mostly sub-Saharan Africa and Central and Southern Asia. And also this could even become worse, because the COVID-19 pandemic is still with us. And in the seminar that we attended this morning, Maria Francesca, we heard about the inequalities in vaccines also. Under a high damage scenario, the number of women and girls in poverty by the end of 2022 could be as high as close to 450 million. So as we heard, the crisis has disrupted food production and supply chain, and this has worsened food insecurity. And as a result, women and girls go hungry, and our colleagues, expert in food security and in our food agencies, know that there was a gap already between women and men before the pandemic, according to reports that they came out with. So women's food insecurity levels were 10% higher than men's in 2020, compared with 6% in 2019. And these gaps were largest in Latin America and the Caribbean, and in Asia. Overall, when we look at progress on the Sustainable Development Goals from a gender perspective, we do see a gloomy picture. And we have taken stock of that when we, for example, measured Beijing +25 already before the COVID crisis. And we know that the COVID crisis has had a devastating impact on results. So UN Women's latest report on the SDGs, which was produced in collaboration with the UN Statistical Division, reveals that globally, out of 18 indicators for SDG 5, only one indicator, which is the proportion of seats held by women in local government, is close to target. That's the one that's close to target. In other areas, such as equality between women and men in time spent on unpaid care, for example, and also when it comes to their women's and men's possibilities to decision making regarding sexual and reproductive health, the world is far from target. So on that, it is, this sounds very negative, but I think we need to know how things are, and then we can discuss what we need to do. Because we did also track together with UNDP how member states responded to the COVID-19 crisis in the Global Gender Response Tracker. And that had an analysis of more than 5,000 measures taken by member states. And we saw that only 13% of the fiscal or social protection and labor market measures took women's economic situation, consciously into consideration. Only 70% of all social protection and labor market measures address rising unpaid care demands and what they do to women. Out of a total of 262 COVID-19 task forces or bodies responsible for response in 130 countries, women make up only a fourth, 24% of decision makers in those groups. This is very discouraging, but I want to finalize, Maria Francesca, also with a few good examples and suggestions where we can build on. We did see, despite this, much more and a relatively strong response from member states when it comes to the issue of violence against women, where member states did much more than before to respond to that. It was, however, too ad hoc and not funded enough, but it was a much more solid response than before. Also, we did see examples of social protection response in some countries in Latin America. Countries also like South Africa and Togo made efforts to really address those holes in social protection systems in terms of women's rights. We saw also Kenya and Senegal very consciously spearheaded public procurement programs, which connect women small-scale producers to a predictable source of income in their programs. And then I think we'll come back to responses from the UN system, obviously programs in the countries, much more of common programs between UN agencies. We also have other vehicles like the upcoming Commission on the Status of Women, which addresses climate change and gender this year. We have the Common Agenda. We have different initiatives together where we have a lot of thinking and action that can address this. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you, Åsa. Yes, I like that you put forward some positive lessons learned or initiatives as well, because I believe indeed that this is something we can say in the disaster this pandemic has brought to all of us. In fact, there is a raising awareness of the gaps and the need to act, which is a lesson learned from it. But let me go to our last panelist, but not the least, indeed, the special representative of ILO to the UN and director of the office, Ms. Beate Andres. Beate, please.
Thank you, Maria Francesca. And I see that the chair is raising her hand, so I'm not sure whether I should move.
Sí,
please. Yes.
Sí, un minuto. Sí, un segundito.
Just a small moment. Just a moment. Maria Francesca, can you hear me?
Sure.
Fine. So I would like to ask all speakers to respect the same criterion. If you're going to speak 3 minutes, so the first speaker spoke for 3 minutes, the second spoke for 7 minutes. It seems to me that it would be good for everybody to have the same possibility, follow the same system. 7 minutes, or, as you said at the beginning, 3 minutes, then a pause, and then a second round of 3 minutes. Am I clear in what I'm saying?
Very clear, but this was the first session of presentations, and each speaker had 6 minutes, and then they will have a second set of presentations for 6 minutes each. And the intervening from the floor will be up to 3 minutes. That's how I understood it. But if I was wrong, of course, I apologize.
Sí, se entendió mal y el primero.
No, The first speaker, Mr. Simoli, spoke very quickly and took up only 3 minutes, so it wasn't clearly understood what was said. But we can fix this, and we can give the floor for the second time to Mr. Simoli. Am I being clear? If Ms. Andres speaks for 6 minutes, then Mr. Simoli or Mr. Torero have the possibility to have a bit more time.
Of course, if you say so.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Maria Francesca, you know why? Because we are trying to have in the Commission, we hope to have representatives from the organizations and the regional groups. So it's an issue of giving equal possibilities to all. Thank you very much.
Yes. Can Beate make her presentation before we go back to Cimoli?
Yes, thank you so much, Francesca. And I will stick to the script and first give kind of a summary and overview of the data. We have the analysis we've done, and then assume that we come back with the policy recommendations later.
Yes.
Yes, good, very good. So first of all, I'm afraid I've been trying to look at this situation in a positive light, but our data actually corroborates what we've heard from the regions, from the FAO and from UN Women, that the overall picture is rather gloomy. However, there are some bright spots. So let me start briefly with employment. The overall employment situation has been devastating on workers, and in particular women and youth. We've estimated 255 million jobs were lost during the pandemic due to business closures. However, we also see a slow recovery of the labor market now, but unemployment this year will still be very high and up more than 200 million. And we do see a divergence in labor market recovery. And that's actually the most concerning trend, where some countries don't seem to be able to boost employment at the same speed as others. And this, of course, is very much linked to fiscal stimulus measures, which were imposed more in developed countries than in developing countries. I'd also like to comment quickly on the observation from UN Women in relation to care work, which again is something we've also observed in terms of the labor market trend. On the bright side, and we will see this in March when we launch a new global report on the care economy, we actually see a growing trend of legal measures enacted to formalize care work. And I think that's a positive trend, which we hope, of course, we can further encourage through our work. Now, allow me to quickly zoom in specifically on social protection. And this is all I will say, and then I finish. What we've seen on social protection, first, is that the crisis has put a spotlight on the social protection deficits. More than 4 billion people, that is the majority of people in the world, are still not protected by any social protection measure. And this affects in particular workers in the informal economy, women often being overrepresented there, estimated at 2 billion workers. Now, if you look more deeply into the situation, and I will try to quickly share my screen and just show one slide, you will see that the situation is also very different from one region to the other. So what you can see here is the regional breakdown. So the situation looks much better in Europe and Central Asia, and very, very discouraging in Africa, the Arab states. And again, we've seen some of this also from the regional presentations. And then if you look at some of the social protection measures specifically, we have seen that unemployment and sickness benefits are really very limited, globally speaking. And of course, these benefits are most critical in protecting jobs and during a pandemic to stop the transmission of disease. So that's something where a lot of work needs to be done. Second, we have seen, and UNICEF of course has also very good data on this, that the vast majority of children still don't receive any child or family benefit. And in some countries, they were actually pushed back into child labor to supplement family income because of poverty. We've also seen that the majority of childbearing women receive no maternity benefit globally. Again, another major deficit that needs to be addressed. And only 2/3 of people worldwide are protected by some form of health protection measure. Now, again, looking at the bright side, we have estimated, we've counted more than 3,860 social protection measures being enacted worldwide. And the counting is still ongoing. Some of these measures, of course, have only been partial. And as we've heard from young women, not really gender responsive or also child responsive. And there is a risk that many of these measures will now be rolled back because of fiscal constraints. So we see there an urgent need to ring fence the gains that have been made, and to some extent also gains made during the crisis because of the emergency measures that were enacted, and in particular to close the financing gap and to expand fiscal space in the countries. So it's a question now for countries, as we say, to take either the high road towards social protection or the low road. And needless to say, the low road will only increase poverty and suffering, whereas the high road, in our view, is actually an ethical but also a rational choice, because it does support economic development if combined with jobs. And I will come back to this later. I'll stop here. Thank you so much, Chair, and thank you, Francesca, for giving me the floor.
Thank you, Beate. Very, very clear presentation. And now I go back with great pleasure to my friend Mario Cimoli, the Deputy Executive Secretary of ECLAC, who had less time than others, and I apologize for that. Please, Mario, to complete the first part, the one about the assessment, because we will have all the panelists coming back later on the look ahead part.
Gracias, muchísimas gracias. Solo hacer un punto que me parece importante.
Just a point that I think is important, and that is that we do need to consider if you put together everything that we've said, all the panelists have said, that poverty has increased, we've increased the informal economy, the situation of women has worsened, and that of children as well. So if we're all presenting this and we don't understand how the economic model is functioning, how we can correct the economic and social model, then the steps which we are going to take will only reproduce what we've seen already. So in the second part, I will come back to this, but we must think how the United Nations must work. We always have this, the asymmetries between the developed countries and those countries in Latin America, Asia, and Africa. The gap will increase. Now, when we talk about multilateralism, how can we achieve multilateralism unless we take these structural conditions into account? This is what the vaccine has done. But we must think how we must intervene so that these models are corrected, but not with just one variable, but how they can interrelate it better. I just wanted to say this because it does seem to me that every statement has been said. The panorama in Asia, Africa, and Latin America because of its structural situation, continue to be the same or worsen. So the question I have, and the question which we must ask ourselves, is how we are going to determine what is the mechanism to correct this, and how can this symmetry, which is increasing, how through multilateralism via the UN can we correct this? So look at what happened with COVID. It's clear. That's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for pointing out, yes, the structural issues we need to address. It's not just dealing with the consequence or the impact of COVID, but looking even before COVID, where the inequalities we were falling behind compared to the SDGs. So totally well taken point indeed. Now we heard the presentations, and yes, it's a grim picture, but as it was also said, that there are lessons to learn from this, as we just said. And I would like to open the floor to the distinguished participants for comments and questions. And I have to remind everybody of the 3 minutes or less time limit for the interventions. And I thank you for your cooperation on this. And the, you know, there is a speaker's request form on the Zoom platform to be used to ask for the floor. But I have already the pleasure to announce we have 3 requests for the floor. And these are the distinguished representative of Cuba, the Dominican Republic, and Portugal. And so I will first give the floor to the distinguished representative of Cuba, followed by Dominican Republic and Portugal. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Madam Moderator. Thank you to the panel. I believe that the CSD has brought together a panel of experts who are very well positioned to discuss this issue. I'd like to add that the presentation from ECLAC and the work of that agency for development and eliminating poverty, not just in the context of COVID-19 pandemic in my country, it has been demonstrative of the role played by ECLAC, the important role it plays in our region. So I'd like to take this opportunity to put forward a couple of questions to the representative of ECLAC. So I couldn't agree more with much of what you have said as to the fact that we can not continue with the same structural models for development if we want to have sustainable development. So I would like to ask if the representative of ECLAC could go into more detail as he sees it as to the role of ECLAC in dealing with poverty in public policies, and how can we work to resolve the structural problems of development. We believe that there are structural problems, the development role and the international economic order as it currently stands. We'd like to have your view on that position. Thank you very much, Ms. Moderator, and thank you to the panelists.
I thank the distinguished representative of Cuba, and before giving the floor to the Dominican Republic representative, I note there is also a fourth request for the floor from Argentina. So the floor is now with the Dominican Republic representative, please.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much to all for the briefings and for giving us the time. Now for the Dominican Republic, we'd like to consider some of the practices which we are implementing with regard to this theme, but specifically we will consider we have launched some projects which we consider are important pillars in addressing how we can recover. Now, one of the strategies that we are implementing is training and capacity building. We understand that we must give trust in people. They are capable of producing and looking after themselves and achieve their goals. So we've done this through a training school which began for elderly people, not just to improve the quality of life of these people, but also to generate jobs, decent work and training, because there's a big gap in terms of informal employment and also for care for these people. And we've also included the elderly people. Now, this has been one of the themes that has been taken into account, and for that reason, we have created a situation in which seniors can take part in employment that is available in their communities. There are other themes, such as, for example, dealing with poverty and measuring poverty. So a debate has been ongoing. Now, poverty is multidimensional. We understand that there are factors which, of course, are being looked at from the multidimensional aspect of poverty. Nevertheless, in terms of elderly people, this is not reflected necessarily in the figures. So what we have done is to create a tool, so determine this, which allows us not only to see and measure the multidimensional poverty, but also identify who could potentially fall into poverty in a situation such as COVID-19 or any other emergency. And we've achieved this in terms of natural disasters, etc., and the hurricane, etc. We've obtained much information as to the vulnerability of certain groups affected by these things. And we've used this tool for that. Now, finally, through strategies, we've been able to implement a number of agreements, interinstitutional agreements, between civil society and the public and private sector, to focus on the whole life cycle of all these projects. Also, to reconsider social protection and how we can improve it and increase the coverage of social protection and all the networks of support to vulnerable people. We want to take this opportunity to deal with this ongoing inadequacy in our system to improve the care, and we have a program which is called the For the Families Care. So we're dealing with senior people to give them an income so that they can undertake this work. So we want to improve this when we ensure that there is more in the formal sector, more work in the formal sector, so that we increase social protection with programs that we have implemented. We've talked about pensions. When people have not contributed sufficiently to the pension system, then we can help them and provide them with pensions and with food and medicines to which they do not have access. Thank you very much.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Dominican Republic and give the floor to the representative of Portugal now, please, followed by Argentina. First, Portugal.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. Allow me first to thank the representatives from the UN system for presenting the work to ensure inclusive and resilient recovery from COVID-19 for sustainable livelihoods, well-being, and dignity for all. And I would like to ask a question to the representative of UN Women and to the chief economist of FAO. I will start with Ms. Regner. Could you share some good practices in supporting women and other family farmers and small-scale producers to improve productivity and strengthening food systems? And to the chief economist of FAO, do we have good examples of integrated policy that leverage synergies between policies and measures that aim to end poverty and hunger, referring especially to social protection and food security measures or poverty reduction and food security strategies? I know that they can also be responded during the second segment, so I will look forward. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your very clear questions and sense of timing. And now is the distinguished representative of Argentina who will take the floor. Please, you have the floor, madam.
Muchas gracias a la moderadora y buenas tardes a todas y todos. Quisiéramos agradecer las presentaciones de...
Good afternoon to everybody. I'd like to thank all the panelists for their briefings. Now we have two questions and comments. The first is the following. How can we ensure that there's a holistic approach to within the UN system in addressing poverty and hunger? So we'd like to have concrete illustrations as to how they work with other UN bodies on this issue. So this is in line with the need to have a better functioning cooperation within the UN. Now, my next question is the following. In a world in which we continue to have hunger and malnutrition at alarming levels, it's essential that we work with everybody to ensure cooperation between countries based on solidarity in order to ensure zero hunger. So we believe that the FAO should make a substantial contribution. We also consider it's vital to have international trade system based on rules. and with the International Trade Organization Center, with systems based on efficient measures, particularly for developing countries. Now, in 2020, ECLAC, together with the FAO, published a document entitled Food Systems and COVID-19, Measures for Social Protection, and they shared important steps which are implemented with states in Latin America and the Caribbean during the pandemic to deal with food security and enhancing protecting agricultural producers and their families. So we'd like to ask the panelists for some specific examples of how the food systems have demonstrated their resilience to the pandemic, and how is it possible to strengthen them, taking into account a human rights approach. Thank you very much. Apologize. I'd like to, when I said when I referred to the OMC in Spanish, I meant the World Trade Organization. Thank you.
That's understood. Thank you very much for these very good questions. So we have, with this, concluded our list of speakers for this first round, and there are very pertinent questions for all of you panelists, starting with ECLAC and the structural changes which are needed. I deem that ILO would be the most appropriate to address the question raised by the Dominican Republic, but FAO, UN Women heard from Portugal and Argentina a lot of questions, and also ECLAC again from Argentina about the trade rules. If you want panelists to come in and give specific answers to these questions now, or is the question I ask you, or you prefer to wrap the answers into the second session of your interventions, which we can start now, because these are all about, in fact, looking ahead, how to address these problems. So I suggest that you might wrap the answers together with the second part of your interventions, if that is okay with you. If there are no objections, I would assume that that is okay. And so let's proceed for the second round of presentations from our colleagues from the UN system. And these are more focused on the way forward, the solutions, what we can do. And it's my pleasure to start again this second round with Mario Cimoli, the Deputy Executive Secretary of ECLAC. Please, Mario, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I will, in a moment, present some slides. Just a second. I believe that the questions, we will relate them to the second part. So I believe that Cuba put forward a very important point. So first is the role of the state and the role of multilateralism. I would like to consider a decisive thing. Before COVID, we did have a welfare system, social assistance, social policies with important asymmetries for the less developed countries. Now, if we talk about regions, Latin America, Europe, and the US, these policies differed. But there were other asymmetries present, and this is related to the social conditions. The asymmetry in productive capacity, that we have a high level of the informal sector, is where we have a productive system which does not produce formal sector jobs. And this means that the informal sector is larger. Now, the technologies, now, it's very clear that with the vaccines, we've seen the imbalance in the technological capacities between Europe, the US, and the other geographical areas. This was enormous, this gap, these asymmetries. Now, also, all these asymmetries, well, there's the taxation system, taxes in the US and Europe, as regards the coverage of taxes with regard to other parts of the world. There's asymmetries of a considerable order. So it's clear that we need to have a policies with the Federal Reserve or the European Central Bank is much easier than in the central banks in countries which are developing. So this asymmetries have been demonstrated by COVID-19, and it's actually increased. So what's happening? We see that the developed countries have large, enormous policies that affect millions of peoples, and other economies are restricted in this regard. Now, there's an increase in demand for products, and this has an impact in terms of inflation. So there are these asymmetries which exist, and these are worsening. And if we don't understand this, it means that we don't understand the political decision we need to take. Now, Cuba says something which is very important. We need to take into account all this. It means that state policies are vital. In Europe, they've been implementing policies. The US has also implemented employment policies, welfare policies, industrial policies. So the state does play a fundamental role. Now, multilateralism, we are seeing that at times there is asymmetry. Now, so we are dealing with these economies. They need to enhance their structures, enhance productive structures, remove the informality. It's difficult otherwise to have any effective policies. What's happening, we're going backwards. And there's a more important point. In a world of this kind, we, in the multilateral system, we need to understand how can we recognize these asymmetries. This is the most important question. Are we continue to say that it's not important, or must we concentrate and focus on how we can resolve these asymmetries? This is an important point. Now, there's the industrial policies for small and medium-sized enterprises to increase jobs. If there's no employment, then it's difficult to improve the economy. We need to look at the technology and social policies to ensure there are financial transfers and a greater use of the social protection system. So we're talking about policies, we're talking about taxation. We need to have progressive taxation. So many of our countries in the region do have taxation which is regressive. So when we want to resolve these problems, we have a productive system which does not create jobs, and we have a weak taxation system. There are structural problems. When we're talking about multilateralism, we need to include all this. So the different countries, they all need policies, but we need a multilateral policy also, which allows us to deal with these asymmetries and see what are the real asymmetries preventing multilateralism. Now, ECLAC and the countries in the region are working on the issue of the vaccine, the sufficient supply of vaccines. We didn't have any vaccines, and so we could not be self-sufficient with regard to the vaccine. We noted that the problem was that we needed a technological transfer. So the question was, how can we resolve this if we do not deal with transfer of technology? And how can we ensure that we have vaccines if we don't deal with the trade system? Now, in Latin America, they produce raw materials, but we need to consider how we should look at the financing as well. There are countries in the region which are increasing the financing. We need to discuss and have we're talking with the same rules as were in place before. But when we talk about asymmetry, we need to look at these asymmetries. There are many countries which are left aside and not taken into account. So this is an important point of this. This is what I wanted to say with regard to the first point. So Cuba was asking the role of the state. Yes, the state has an important role in Cuba. There's been the problem of the vaccines. So the state has a role to play to work with the market to ensure that vaccines are available. Now, the vaccine has taught us that we need to rediscuss multilateralism in all its dimensions and how we can ensure development, transfers of technology, funding. And if we don't do this, then we will be talking about the same things without stop. So what Argentina said with regard to examples of what the agencies are doing, this is very important. What ECLAC has done under the direction of its secretary, executive secretary, in Honduras, El Salvador, and Mexico, we've been dealing with migration. And this was a very important case to work together to deal with the funding and build on local development so that migration is not something which people have to do. So there are many examples. We need to work on all this. So I think what we have to say is that we need to look at society. If we do not include a far-reaching debate on how wealth is created, the global distribution, financing, access to the market, if we don't do this, then we will continue in future years to encounter for the same time the issues that we're looking at now, poverty, etc. So this is something which has taught us, this is what the pandemic has taught us, and it must be a far-reaching debate within our system. This is the most important, and we do have the capacity to deal with this and have this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. ECLAC is indeed very active and it's a very good also supporting the data collection and knowledge repository at the regional level. Now we would like to hear, I would like to call again on Munir Tabet from ESQA, the Deputy Executive Secretary, please.
Yes, can you hear me well?
Yes, we hear and we see your shared screen too.
Excellent. I think Mario said a lot of what I wanted to say in terms of introduction. We have today a historical opportunity, another historical opportunity to transform structurally not only national economies, but the global economy. If we are going to be able to build forward better, because building back would not get us to the level of social equity, employment, and the development indicators will remain as poor as they are right now, whether they belong to the SDGs or elsewhere. That's the sense of the urgency that I believe drove the Secretary General to talk about the need for a new social contract at the global level as well as the national level, a social contract that sees us building forward better, utilizing all the assets that we have, whether they are natural, human, or in terms of the IT revolution, the fourth industrial revolution, AI, and so on. We are in a moment where we see companies and individuals making incredible progress in terms of their wealth, while whole countries are unable to access vaccines at a very small portion of that wealth. So going from the global that Mario spoke about, I will go directly to the national level and talk a little bit about the policy recommendations that ESQA has put forward and has supported over the past few months during the pandemic, where we have produced about 14 policy briefs and 163 recommendations on these 7 and more aspects of the first recommendation was very particular to the region, is the idea of putting forward a solidarity tax, whether a regional solidarity tax or a national solidarity tax that builds a lot on the region's cultural dimensions of generosity, Islamic finance, zakat, and historic kind of tradition of helping the neighbor. That solidarity tax has been received rather positively, but it has to be, of course, equated and accompanied by significant economic growth, significant economic reforms in terms of rethinking the macro policy in the region, fundamental need to diversify the economies, support small, medium enterprises, promote the private sector, with the major goal of creating employment and moving more people out of the informal into the formal sector. On the social side, the whole idea is to expand the universal social protection to cover the 65% that are still uncovered, to expand the social financing base through progressive taxation and contribution-based financing. We held a ministerial forum on this issue. It was very successful and adopted a statement that will move forward with the idea of leaving no one behind. On health, like every other region, prioritize vaccines, particularly to areas that have conflict, that has not pandemic from spreading. Of course, urgent medical care to those who are already a victim of COVID-19. And most importantly, improve the readiness of the healthcare system to prevent or to respond to the next pandemic that is sure to come, but when we don't know. Of course, investing in the public health sector continues to be an important priority for the region. On education, the 100 million children that are out of school, that are half learning online, need to be reintegrated in a much more meaningful manner, particularly through enhancing curricula for better online delivery and a reform for the entire education that exists in the region. On gender, I think it's a clear issue for us. We continue to enhance or promote enhancing the legal protection for victims of domestic violence. We have helped many countries pass a law in this area and strengthening the social protection coverage for women of all ages as part of the broad social protection measures that we've talked about. And in our region, unfortunately, still have to have special laws for protection against child marriages. Finally, on water scarcity, we have a region that's one of the most arid region in the world that's water scarce. We are thinking of prioritizing accessible, safe water for drinking, as well as for hand washing and hygiene, but also advocating for water conservation and a particular measure of considering water operators as critical service providers and allow them to go through the lockdowns when they arrive. I will stop here and take questions if there is a need. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, it's clear that in each region there is a lot of activity, and I thank you for sharing this with all our participants. And I now have the pleasure to give the floor to the next of our panelists, Maximo Torero, FAO Chief Economist, please, for the second round.
Thank you very much, Chair. Let me quickly share some quick ideas and focus a little bit more in. So first, it's important to understand, as some colleagues have already mentioned, there was a significant increase in social protection, and that helped enormously. It reduced the potential impacts of the crisis. But despite that, there were still some problems that we need to take into consideration. The total spending on social protection was around 2.9 trillion or 3% of global GDP in 2021, and has claimed nearly 18% of the global stimulus packages, about 4.5 times higher than the spending in the sector during 2008 and 2009 recession. And almost 17% of the world's population has been covered with at least one cash transfer payment between 2020 and 2021. But the duration of most programs remains short, and the generosity of the cash payments varies across regions, bringing some differences and inequalities. And also we need to understand that many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, are facing significant budget constraints and significant levels of indebtedness, not only public, but also private, which will put significant pressure on continuing this activity. In this graph, what I'm trying to show in the blue and green bars, it depicts the share of the population that receives social assistance pre and post-pandemic. And as you can see, there is a significant increase in the green bars relative to the blue. And the yellow and red circles refer to the adequacy of the benefits that were provided as share of the beneficiaries' pre-transfer income. The graph shows that countries in all regions have responded by expanding the coverage and increasing the generosity of the social transfers net payments, though in some regions, starting from a very low base and is still reaching only a fraction of the population, even after the COVID-induced scale-ups. Now, in this topic, which is one of the dimensions that we need to touch, because social protection helps to reduce the problem of the people which are the most affected, but we also need to increase resilience in other dimensions. So if we want to cope with the crisis that we are facing today, we have to have two levels of resilience. One is preventive, and that's essentially having early warning systems in place, the One Health approach, and also having insurance mechanisms. But in terms of coping with the shock when it happens, which is the second component of resilience, the social protection, of course, plays one role and a major role, especially in the most affected. So COVID-19 exposed triple challenges, and we need to look at three dimensions of social protection. First, the services that are being provided and which risks are covered, and this is comprehensiveness. Second, the financial protection, so how adequately are risks covered, adequacy. And the third one, which is really important, is who is covered. That's the coverage. Now, one of the major challenges was in COVID-19, on our perspective, was targeting. And that means that people, when they were targeting the social protection programs under expansion, they were targeting traditionally beneficiary lists. And they were not understanding that there was a change in the potential people that were affected. So the coverage, because of the not proper availability of real-time data to identify where the new hotspots of poverty and food insecurity were, like what we were referring before, of these significant shifts of the informal economy, which were middle, low middle class, into poverty, and they were not being targeted because they were not in the traditional beneficiary list, could have created a significant lack of efficiency in the targeting of these programs. And that's something that we need to learn from in the future to try to improve it also in the future so that we avoid this problem. Sometimes investing in data could have a huge payoff in terms of the effectiveness on how we bring the solutions. And that's something to learn. Second, the types of services and the comprehensiveness is really important because we should have taken advantage of the expansion of the social protection to also formalize individuals and small and SMEs and micro entrepreneurs. We didn't take advantage of that. And that's something also, again, to learn how through these mechanisms, when we are trying to cope from one emergency, we can help also countries to formalize, which is central. We have seen that informality has been a huge vulnerability in the systems that we have in place and has also shown that if we don't try to change that, it will be very difficult to cope with future shocks like the one we have faced today. And the adequacy, of course, and the magnitude of it is also important, and how the risks are covered properly. Now, a second dimension, and there are many others, I just want to focus on these two, is how inclusive recovery will also require bold measures in support of rural sector. We keep talking about green recovery and so on and so forth, and we don't focus necessarily in the rural sector, and that's where most of the poor people are, most of the vulnerable people are. And if we are going to touch the rural sector, we need to touch agriculture. Here we're just showing that the equivalent of 0.25% of GDP in 2021 is invested in agriculture, in 2022 and 2024, and what will be the impacts of that small investment, how capital accumulation and productivity will boost, how higher rural household labor incomes will increase, lower food prices, and lower production costs for food industry. And here we're just showing 4 countries examples and the significant returns in terms of GDP growth, and also in the reduction of poverty by 2030. In all cases, we will observe a win-win situation. Now, this also requires targeted investments in activities that we know that will have the return that we're expecting. And also in looking at portfolio of investments, not just one silo investment, but a portfolio investment. And that is central in also how the UN should operate where we take advantage of our comparative advantages and specializations to bring together through the UN Resident Coordinator to be able to create a transformation that is needed. And for that, the Food System Summit and the Hub and the way we are looking forward, not looking to the past and how it was done in the past, but how we can move forward in the agri-food system transformation, we need to bring together all the different elements of the UN system. Thank you very much, Chair.
Thank you very much, Maximo. I recall that there were a couple of questions from Portugal and Argentina you may want to address now, and I invite all this rest of the panelists to do the same for the questions which were asked in the first round. Can you briefly address those?
Sure, no problem. There was a question of integrated policies and synergies for poverty and hunger. And I think that's an extremely complex question and very important. And that's how we need to bring this agri-food system approach. One of the things that we normally don't touch is that if we have an action, for example, an action to reduce environmental issues, like reducing emissions through the change of the energy mix, that will have an effect over energy prices and will have an effect over fertilizer industry and effect over food production and hunger. So the approach has to be systematic. We need to understand the goal of reducing hunger and poverty, which they move together, although the numbers not necessarily move together, but they normally will have the same trend, but the magnitudes will be different because poverty and hunger have different dimensionalities. But the actions that we achieve to be able to achieve that have trade-offs, and we need to take into consideration those trade-offs. So again, breaking the silos will help this synergistic approach. The other question was more related to how we can work together. And we believe that one of the movements and that we can move forward of the transformation pathways that the countries are building up for the agri-food system could be a way to empower the UN resident coordinators and to empower the coordination across the different agencies. We cannot keep overlapping our roles, and we have to target where we are the best, in which areas we are performed, which are our mandates, and try to complement our roles. And that will be crucial because the transformation pathways of the countries, if we continue working with them to keep improving together with the countries, will basically create the demand of what is needed. And that is the demand that we need to respond to help the countries to make the change. If we don't respond to that demand, we are failing as a system. And that's where we need to find a way to create the synergies that can be done if we coordinate properly. Thank you.
Indeed, thank you. And now it's my pleasure to give the floor to Åsa Regner, UN Women. You too, Åsa, have received were on the receiving end of a question or two, so please keep that in mind in this second part. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria Francesca, and everybody, member states, for the questions. And I thought I'd start with one concrete example because that's how I understood the question from Portugal. And we luckily have just received evaluation of a big program that we have had together with FAO, IFAD, WFP, and UN Women, together with national governments, and it was supported by Sweden and Norway. And in this program, it was targeting rural women to improve their economic chances. And in this evaluation, and you can find more information on what it actually did, so to speak, it was also covering, I think, the 10 countries in Latin America, Sub-Saharan Africa, and North Africa, and Asia. So in this program, the findings told us that women participating in this program benefited very much from enhanced agricultural practices where they could access productive assets. They learned about labor saving technologies. They saw new market linkages that they could use. And they also went through leadership training in this context. And they did increase their agricultural productivity according to the results. They also obtained more sustainable income and could ensure a better diet for their family. And also interestingly for feminists, and I hope for everyone, is that in this positive results, they also contributed to a positive shift in social norms. which meant that women played a greater role in household and community level decision making, which was measurable. And for example, men in Nepal and Niger reported growing support to improve the status of women in their villages, and they also the men took on more of care responsibilities, unpaid work. Also, women participating in this program were more likely to be elected to local councils and to engage in local government, and which was a very important result. For example, well, this happened in Ethiopia and Liberia. We also saw that impacts were mitigated for women participating in this program during COVID-19. There is more to say around this, and I'm happy to provide you with more information, but that was one example since the question was about that. So there are examples and models to build on. We also have examples from the Sahel, for example. I also wanted, I did mention some solutions already in my first round. I wanted also to draw your attention to a report that we wrote which I think is good, which is called Beyond COVID-19, a feminist plan for sustainability and social justice, which has identified 3 areas, and we mentioned all of them: jobs, care, and climate change in the perspective of COVID and beyond COVID, and how we can rebuild. And just perhaps to point to a few examples of what we have seen. Obviously, to not repeat things that don't work. We know that women, as many as 740 million women in the informal employment need social protection and didn't have that. And important to remember is that when you design social security policies, you need to think of both women and men with the aim of reaching gender equality. It is possible to design social security system which lock women into traditional tasks instead of promoting labor market participation, for example. The same goes for income taxation systems. So that's important to have in mind, not to repeat what didn't work. Also, we know that some well-designed cash transfer programs can be very transformative for women and girls, with gains in food security, school attendance, increased incomes, and greater influence in societies. And then my last point is that women obviously need to be part of decision-making when it comes to climate change, with the transition that we need to go through, to be part of design and decision-making in relation to the new jobs, and that they also go to women. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosa. And for the panelists now to be completing the second round, I would like to call on Beate Andres of ILO to give us a bit of the sense where we can go, what we can do, and also to address the questions, maybe the points which were raised by the participants from the floor. Beate, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much, really, for also facilitating this interactive discussion, because I want to respond first to some of the comments made by the distinguished delegates, and then also, if I may, to the remarks made by the co-panelists. So first on social protection, my colleague from the FAO gave already a very good overview of what needs to be addressed here. So I won't go into further detail, just to say that a key issue is indeed, and we've actually just heard this also from Regner from Young Women, is to actually link social protection to employment creation, and in that process to ensure the economic empowerment and labor market integration of women. Also look at other groups of the population, of course, but gender sensitive social protection measures are absolutely key. And we have in a global report we've launched last year, we have given plenty of examples how this can be done at the national level. So we have the solutions. We just need to scale them up at the country level. And indeed, many countries have have a very good experience on this. The other point our colleague from FAO made is on the formalization. And yes, indeed, many social protection schemes are tied to formal employment. But this doesn't mean that we, from the ILO side at least, haven't invested over the years into formalizing employment. It's one of our biggest efforts, actually. And what we've seen during the COVID crisis is that these social protection measures, if linked to formalization of employment, including through e-formalization, there can be really a virtuous cycle, actually, in terms of formalizing employment as well as creating sustainable social protection systems. So we want to scale this up. We want to take those lessons learned from the crisis and scale it up. And I'll come back to this later. On the economic stimulus measures and some of the comments made by the colleagues from the regional commissions, what we have seen is that in this crisis, globally speaking, there have been significant economic stimulus measures, much more significant than after the financial crisis in 2008. They've also been maintained much longer. However, as I said earlier, there is a real risk of rolling back now. And I think my colleagues have made a very strong plea for this to not to happen, so I won't go into this. I think the question of taxation that they've raised is absolutely critical in this discussion in helping countries, including developing countries, creating the fiscal space. Then briefly, the comment made, or question also from Argentina on trade. What we've observed, and here I'm referring to the recent World Economic Social Outlook report we've published on the development of labor markets, there is a trend of reshoring production. And it's partly related to the disruption of supply chains during the crisis, but also through technological advances, of course. And that reshoring has, of course, an impact on how trade is shaped. And of course, from an ILO perspective, we also support a rules-based trade system, and our standards are critical in this, and we have a very close exchange with the WTO on this. And then on the question or comment also from the delegate from the Dominican Republic on lifelong learning. I think that's also a critical topic that needs to be addressed, and many lessons learned from the COVID crisis here. What we see again from the labor market perspective is significant change in labor market or work arrangements in terms of remote working and temporary work arrangements, increasing worldwide. We know this also, that the gig economy is increasing in terms of its share. And there will be a need to adjust skills and apprenticeship system to help people transition in the years to come. And this takes me to the example I want to give in terms of the solution and how we can work together as a UN system, also a question raised by Argentina. In September last year, the UN Secretary General launched the Global Accelerator on Jobs and Social Protection for Just Transitions. And that platform seeks to increase the job creation, in particular in the care in digital and green economies, and to expand social protection floors to the 4 billion people currently not covered. It's a UN system-wide initiative that's now being discussed really amongst all the relevant entities, and showing also how this connects to existing mechanisms of our institutions. Rather than creating a new mechanism here, we are actually seeking to better connect to existing mechanisms, including the regional commissions. And from the ILO side, we will convene a global forum later this month, which we've been mandated to do so by the International Labour Conference and the resolution that was adopted on the human-centered recovery. And the focus of the forum will be indeed how this accelerator can also be supported by the ILO's constituents, member states, but also, of course, workers and employers organizations. So we are really trying to connect the dots here between our members and what is discussed at the UN. And I would, in closing, I would like to invite all delegates here and my fellow colleagues from the UN system to join this effort and really make this a UN system-wide effort which can boost employment and extend social protection. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your rich presentation of events and initiatives. I have one request from the floor. That is the European Union delegation. I would like to invite others if you want to intervene at this stage and take the floor through the system, the form which is there. Otherwise, at this stage, let me proceed and give the floor to the European Union delegation which requested it. Please.
Thank you, Madam Moderator, and thank you to all the panelists for your important presentations. My name is Leanne and I'm from the EU delegation. The EU and its member states are strongly committed to the implementation of the 2030 Agenda, including through the European Pillar of Social Rights, the European Skills Agenda, the Digital Education Action Plan, a reinforced EU Youth Guarantee, and the European Child Guarantee. The EU's green and digital transformation strategies, the European Green Deal, and the 2030 Digital Compass will all contribute to ensuring that no one is left behind. Internationally, we must all act conscious of the levels of inequality within and between countries, and its multidimensional nature requires us to act with an integrated and concerted approach. We must stand about policies that raise norms and standards for all of society, that rebalance the distribution of primary income, including through labour market regulations and fiscal policies. Reforms such as increasing the minimum wage, improving the earned income tax credit and making the tax code more progressive, and expand social protection coverage. The EU and its member states support, in particular, the ILO Global Call to Action for a human-centred recovery, and welcome the discussions on the UN and ILO call for a global accelerator for jobs and social protection. The EU and its member states commit to work for an economic and social recovery from the crisis that also takes into account the environmental issues and is fully inclusive, sustainable, and resilient. I would like to take this opportunity to ask, how can we improve our cooperation in a more networked and inclusive multilateral system anchored within the United Nations in order to address the shared challenges of poverty and hunger? I would also like to emphasize that the EU will continue to promote and uphold good governance, human rights, including labour rights, decent work conditions, the rule of law, gender equality and non-discrimination, as well as fundamental values and humanitarian principles. Using social dialogue is essential to advance the implementation of all of those principles and values. Thank you.
I thank the delegate of the European Union, and I don't see other requests from the floor, so I think we can spare a few minutes before we close to go back to our panelists and give them 1 minute each maybe to highlight what in their view is the one priority they would like to see action on, and so set the course for a sustainable recovery. Can I invite Mario Cimoli, the first one, to address this question?
Gracias. Creo que el diagnóstico.
I believe the diagnosis that we have is similar. It's difficult to find any differences between our agencies. I believe that the continuing social problems that we have at the level of many regions, and in the case of Latin America, it's clearly a continuing issue. The basic theme is to have proposals and to have policies. I believe that this, the COVID-19 pandemic has taught us that we need to build very strong policies at the multilateral level and have cooperation between agencies to resolve these problems. The theme of working with the FAO on the issue of the food supply and to work with UN Women on establishing jobs, formal jobs, and also to work with the ILO and also work with the other commissions in the context of multilateralism. So the truth is we're very worried, and I'd like to say that when the vaccine question arose, there was a global asymmetry in the arrival of these vaccines to the most remote areas of our societies and in poor areas. There was very little effort taken at the multilateral level to resolve this problem. But if we don't resolve it, the social problem and the issue of access and the construction and access to food, then this will be an issue which will continue to worsen because there are countries which can have policies, others which not. Now, the Latin American economies need to have more proactive policies in our societies. I can just give one example which worked very well. The digital basket, let's say, it was not important, not only important. I'm talking about the digital basket that everybody could have access to during the COVID-19. It was a very important theme. And this regards technology. So if we don't understand the model, if we go towards the developed countries and say, look, the dialogue that we're having, that we must have with regard to financing, which must be changed, we must have a dialogue with regard to access to technology, this must change. This is the debate we must have, work together and united for this. ECLAC is working in these reforms, and we believe it's work that we must do together. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mario. And now I'll turn to Munir Tabet for 1 minute, one priority.
If I were to say one single priority, it would have to be jobs, job creation. Without jobs, there is nothing that one can do. So jobs require a multitude of other reforms, including diversifications of the national economies. But better integration in the global economy. Better integration in the global economy requires critical transformation of how the global economy is currently functioning and crowding out poorer, more vulnerable countries as well as groups of individuals. So we have a historic opportunity, but it's not clear whether the political will is still there. The political will demonstrated during the pandemic that most countries rushed to provide vaccine and safe vaccines to their own citizens prior to reaching out in the solidarity. So the solidarity transforms itself into a necessity when we understand the comprehension of if one person is left unvaccinated, we're all still unsafe. And I think you can stay the same theme. If a person remains unemployed, we're all going to have to pay the consequences of this. So employment for us is the most important, but decent employment in sectors that are growing, innovation, green economy, and circular economy. I will stop at that because that's the most fundamental aspect of it. If otherwise, keep spending on social spending, keep people out of work, and we are back into the same circle. So building forward better through employment, through international collaboration and multilateralism that Mario indicated. Thank you.
Thank you, very clear indeed. Same question for the others. Maximo, one priority in 1 minute.
So if I have to take one priority in 1 minute, I will take reduction of inequalities. I think what we are observing today is that any of these type of shocks and any future shock, the only thing that it does is exacerbate inequalities and creates a negative impact of those inequalities that already existed. And those go within the countries, but also between countries. So we keep talking, and just to give an example, about the true cost of food. And the reason why we talk about the true cost of food is whatever we produce can create externalities and has value inside that not necessarily is priced. We have to do exactly the same with policies. What one country does has a consequence on another country. And what we are observing today is that economies that can recover because they have enormous amount of resources are creating a negative effect on economies that cannot recover because they don't have that amount of resources. So we need to value this true value and true cost of the policies being implemented. And if we want to be fair, that has to be value and has to be paid. And we don't need to impose taxes. That is clear, and we can measure it and we can value it. Thank you.
Thank you. Very the economist approach, but with a social impact. Now I will turn indeed to Ausa, please, for your priority in 1 minute.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think I did use time to mention a few areas, but maybe just to say care, if I have to choose one thing that we haven't touched so much upon, investments in childcare to liberate parents, both young mothers and fathers, so they can take up paid work. Parental schemes which both make it possible for fathers and mothers to stay at home with their toddlers so that the other one can take up paid work, with incentives for fathers to do so, if I can choose. And also think of elderly care with the demographic situation that we have in many countries. Also, elderly care fall on women's shoulders as it is today, and it's just not sustainable. We cannot continue that way, to reiterate what Mario said. So those are some suggestions from me. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very important points. And our last speaker, Beate, please, from the ILO viewpoint, 1 minute, one priority.
Yeah, thank you. Well, it's a variation of the same theme, to reverse the great divergence in recovery and to truly build forward better. And as Munir said, jobs, and in particular decent jobs, and if I can add green jobs in the care economy, they are a key way of working your way out of poverty, and hopefully building also more sustainable societies. So thank you very much.
Very, very well put. Thank you. I would say from my side that what I hear and I heard through you today really points to the fact that the social pillar of sustainable development needs to be reinforced. We have to work more on that pillar. We have to spell out what it means. And you did so well with the social protection system, with formalizing informal jobs, with giving, of course, dignity to people. And also you said, I have to extrapolate a little bit, but I think you said it, that the tools are there. We know what to do. The recipes are known. We need the courage and the ability to implement, to make the right choices, whether it's government or individuals. But we need to be bold and do it at the global level, at the local level, of course. And finally, I heard, and that's something I would also like to highlight, the importance of the global level and the multilateral cooperation, solidarity, but also cooperation in the policy sense at the multilateral level, so that we can come up with a common view of the issues and address the solution in a cooperative, inclusive manner. With this, I will be very happy to pass the floor back to the chair, Madam Ambassador, for your conclusions. And thank the panelists, of course, for their time and wisdom.
Ok, gracias, María Francesca. Hemos llegado al final de este diálogo.
We have reached the end of this interactive dialogue with senior officials of the United Nations system on the priority theme. I thank the moderator, Ms. Batolisano, for her work, and also I'd like to thank the distinguished panelists and the delegations for actively participating in an interesting exchange of views. Now, before adjourning, I would like to remind you that the Commission will hold a multi-stakeholder forum on the priority theme tomorrow morning at 10 a.m. on this platform. The meeting is adjourned.